SpaceX has fired up Raptor 3 for the very first time, Blue Origin's been practicing their port procedures, ISRO have revealed who will be training in Houston and flying on Axiom 4, we've got updates on Starliner and so much more this week in Spaceflight. We're going to kick things off with the first firing of a next generation engine, but Raptor 3 can wait for a moment because Rocket Lab has fired up its new Archimedes engine for the first time. You may remember from previous episodes that Rocket Lab has been progressing towards the first static fire by performing small tests of individual components during the development process. By taking a slow, methodical approach, the company hopes it has got past the difficulties of engine development earlier in the process and that the current engine is close to a production version. Following this approach, the company has performed hundreds of engine tests, including a few burns. Earlier this week, Rocket Lab released a picture of a test at low power levels, followed by a photo of a test fire at 102% thrust a few days later. The company stated in a news release that, quote, Archimedes performed well and ticked off several key test objectives. Interestingly, the photos of the test show a different colour than what we'd expect from a methane-powered engine. Instead of the blues and purples associated with methane, Archimedes' exhaust is orange and yellow. What causes this difference is not clear, as Blue Origin's BE4 engine, which uses the same engine cycle as Archimedes, does have a distinctly blue flame. Rocket Lab is developing this Archimedes engine for the propulsion system of its upcoming Neutron rocket. The reusable first stage of this rocket will be powered by 9 of these engines, and the upper stage will sport a vacuum-optimized version of Archimedes. In an earnings presentation published this week, Rocket Lab released new details about this medium-lift rocket. The presentation showed that all parts of the rocket now have flight hardware in production and qualification. In addition to progressing on this vehicle, the company is also working to get the launch pad ready for flight and production facilities ready to scale up manufacturing. Another detail teased in the presentation is that Rocket Lab wants to become an end-to-end space company by launching its own spacecraft to offer, quote, space data and services. Details of this plan were not included, but Rocket Lab has previously stated that Neutron is designed to launch large satellite constellations. Interesting. Neutron's inaugural flight is currently scheduled for mid-2025. While the laboratory is showing progress with Neutron, it still has a long way to go to meet that date. The company has yet to showcase a completed rocket, and even if it had one right now, the launch site is nowhere near completion. Eventually, Rocket Lab has to test Neutron outside to make sure it's ready to fly. That's lucky for us because these tests tend to deliver some cool photos and videos that we love to see. Blue Origin is steadily moving towards the first launch of its upcoming heavy-lift New Glenn rocket. This week, the company was testing first-stage recovery operations with a simulator stage right in front of our cameras in Port Canaveral. During the test, the stage was turned to its vertical position on the so-called breakover fixture. Blue Origin uses this structure in tandem with a crane and a remotely operated lift tool to break over the booster, or change its orientation between vertical and horizontal. This procedure is part of the recovery process, as the stage will arrive in port vertically, much like SpaceX's Falcon 9, and then needs to be transported horizontally to the company's facilities where it can be refurbished, also like the Falcon 9. And speaking of the Falcon 9, while Blue Origin was performing this test, SpaceX happened to be working on a Falcon 9 booster nearby. Seeing these boosters next to each other just makes it very clear how massive New Glenn is. Not only is its first stage taller than Falcon 9's, it's also much wider. New Glenn is truly a heavy-lift rocket. The next step in New Glenn's test campaign will be a full recovery rehearsal with the landing vessel, creatively named Landing Platform Vessel 1. And speaking of which, this barge was spotted leaving France just a few days ago, where it was being outfitted, and it's now on its way to Florida. In addition to the tests with the simulator stage, Blue has also been testing actual flight hardware. CEO David Limp shared footage of a first stage forward module performing tests. One video showed a test of the rocket's fins, which are roughly the size of a car and steer the rocket on both ascent and descent. Another video showed the reaction control system in action, which is used to orient the booster in the vacuum of space and during landing. Both systems are essential pieces of hardware for reusability. New Glenn's first flight is currently scheduled for late September, but it's likely to slip to October. And alongside the port testing, the upper stage for this launch was also spotted at the Cape this week. With all this hardware moving around, the company is visibly working hard to get this rocket off the ground, and personally, with Starship Flight 5 and New Glenn Flight 1 potentially just weeks apart, that could lead to a very exciting latter half of 2024. As you may have already heard by now, NASA held a conference this week about ISS operations, and it was dominated by Starliner news. In fact, it was the first Starliner conference for 2 weeks. The last 60 days have been a long story, but let me quickly summarise it for you in case you missed it. Boeing has been trying to figure out the cause of thruster failures that Starliner Calypso experienced on its journey to the International Space Station a few months ago. While the capsule and NASA astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore were originally set to stay at the station for 8 days, their stay has been extended indefinitely to allow Boeing more time to diagnose the issue. This week, NASA was still unable to announce a return date, but the agency did outline all options it's considering to get Butch and Sunny back to Earth, including the use of Crew Dragon. And some of those options are interesting, to say the least. Additionally, NASA announced that Boeing had finally found a possible cause of the thruster issues. A Teflon seal inside an oxidizer valve was affected by heat, causing an improper seal and ultimately leading to misbehaving thrusters. While the issue seemed to solve itself after the thrusters cooled down, the findings has caused disagreement within the agency on whether the safety margins on Starliner are still enough for the crew to return. This prompted NASA to consider more ways Butch and Sunny could possibly return, but the agency first needed to buy some time to decide. The problem is that Starliner currently occupies one of the 2 ports on the ISS that US crew vehicles can dock to, and the other is taken by Dragon Endeavour for the Crew 8 mission. NASA needs Starliner to leave before it can launch the next crew rotation mission, Crew 9. This mission was originally coming up later this month, but has now been delayed to September 24th, and in the meantime, NASA will decide whether Starliner is safe enough to return with its crew on board. But what if NASA determines that Butch and Sunny cannot return on Starliner? Well, that's where SpaceX comes in. While Crew 9 was originally set to launch a crew of 4, NASA and SpaceX have researched the option to launch with 2 astronauts instead. In this scenario, Starliner would leave without Butch and Sunny, who will then stay on the ISS until February. This situation would also require Boeing to reconfigure and test Starliner software for an uncrewed return. You might have noticed that in this scenario, there is some time between Starliner's undocking and Crew 9's arrival. During this period, Butch and Sunny would have no lifeboat in case of an emergency on board the ISS. To fill this gap, NASA has asked SpaceX to prepare for the option to configure Crew 8's Dragon for an emergency return with 7 passengers. This would be Crew 8's original crew, plus Butch and Sunny, plus NASA astronaut Tracy Caldwell Dyson in case her Soyuz capsule experiences an issue. She launched on Soyuz MS-25 back in March. It's worth noting that NASA still considers Starliner safe for an emergency return. NASA's Ken Bowersox explained that this is because the agency is willing to accept more risk in these contingency scenarios, which are unlikely to begin with. Commercial Crew Program Manager Steve Stitch explained further.
We still agree that the right course of action would be to return Butch and Sunny in Starliner. Should there be an emergency at ISS where it's an uninhabitable environment or they need to get off station, Starliner would be their best option, and we still feel confident in that.
It may be confusing folks that we're willing to put the crew on for a contingency return, but still talking about the planned return. And part of that is how we make decisions about risk in contingency situations.
Even though NASA has publicly confirmed that it has plans to return Starliner Calypso without its crew, the agency has not yet decided whether to do so. NASA is currently evaluating their options and bringing in more expert opinions from inside the agency. It could very well be that the agency deems Starliner safe enough for Butch and Sunny to return, in which case Crew 9 will fly with its original crew. NASA leadership made it very clear that they have these multiple contingencies which have not been activated, but can be if required. For now, we'll have to wait and see which path NASA chooses. Either way, we'll be covering whatever happens. And now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with the crew for the upcoming Axiom 4 mission to the International Space Station, and it's quite the international bunch. The commander is former NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson, who previously flew on Axiom 2 and is also Axiom's Director of Human Spaceflight. Indian Space Research Organisation astronaut Shubhanshu Shukla will be in the right seat as the pilot, and the mission specialists will be ESA astronauts Sławomir Znański of Poland and Tibor Kapu of Hungary. Shukla will fly on this mission as part of an agreement between the US and India that we detailed in a previous episode of This Week in Spaceflight. As part of this agreement, Shukla will undergo training at NASA's Johnson Space Center alongside ISRO astronaut Prashan Balakrishnan Nair, who will also serve as his colleague's backup for the Axiom 4 mission. The crew will visit the ISS for 14 days, during which the astronauts will perform scientific research and technology demonstrations. The mission was originally scheduled for October, but has now been pushed to next year as the longer than expected stay of Starliner Calypso has rearranged the station's busy schedule of visiting vehicles. Also this week, the next version of SpaceX's Raptor engine breathed fire for the first time. The test was first spotted by our McGregor live cameras and later confirmed when Gwen Shotwell shared a photo of the Raptor 3 test on social media. Compared to earlier versions of the engine, Raptor 3 looks very barren. So much so that ULA CEO Tori Bruno commented earlier that the engine might not have been fully assembled, a comment that Shotwell likely referred to by saying that the engine, in fact, works pretty well. Whether the tested engine was truly fully assembled remains to be seen. We'll surely keep an eye on it, so stay tuned to next week's Starbase update for more details on Raptor 3. And by the way, Tori later congratulated Elon Musk on this successful test. So, bants. This week was apparently the week of engine testing, as Stoke Space has been performing more tests on its methane-powered full-flow stage combustion cycle engine. This engine is set to power the first stage of Stoke's upcoming fully reusable rocket called Nova. Stoke CEO Andy Lapser shared this video of a suction test on social media. During this test, the engine's pumps were driven to the point where gas bubbles form in the high-pressure liquid propellants. This phenomenon is called cavitation, and its effects on rocket engines are, let's say, less than desirable. It doesn't usually end well for the engine. Stoke seems to be very happy with the test results, as Lapser reported that the test showed a quote, better than expected margin. Later in the week, Lapser added that the company is reaching the end of the test campaign for the engine on its current test stand, and is nearing completion of a vertical test stand for Nova's first stage. Viasat has announced that the troubled Viasat 3 Americas satellite has finally entered commercial service. The news comes well over a year after the satellite was launched atop a Falcon Heavy on May 1st, 2023. You may recall that the satellite experienced an anomaly during deployment of its main antenna, threatening to turn the satellite into an expensive piece of space junk. But not all was lost, as the company has been able to contact the satellite and verify all other systems on board the satellite are performing well. Viasat has been testing the satellite since and is now ready to offer it for commercial service, albeit at a significantly reduced capacity, resiliency and performance. Regardless, this is still a big win for Viasat. Historically only accessible to big budget communications, weather and military satellites, geostationary orbit is now open for business for small satellites. Impulse Space announced a rideshare program to geostationary and other high-energy orbits, with the maiden mission scheduled for 2027. These orbits are usually hard to reach for small satellites, as it requires a lot of propellant to get there. Alternatively, the rocket could directly insert the payload into the target orbit, but that's a much more expensive mission profile that usually doesn't make commercial sense for small satellites. To be able to support these missions, Impulse upgraded its Mira space tug. It now features a new power supply, increased radiation hardening, and advanced avionics that allow precise deployment in geostationary orbit. Firefly Aerospace announced it signed an agreement with L3Harris for up to 20 launches on the company's Alpha rocket. This is in addition to an earlier agreement, so now Firefly has a total of 23 launches for L3Harris on its manifest. The new agreement allows for 2 to 4 launches per year from 2027 to 2031. It is unclear what L3Harris expects to use these launches for. The company develops space-related technologies from weather satellites to missile warning and defense systems, but whatever it plans to send to space, it means that we get to see more launches from the neon green machine. And speaking of launches, let's take a look at what's happened this week and what's coming up next week with Elysia Segal.
Thanks, Ryan. Here's your weekly space traffic report. Starting off the week on August 2nd, an Electron lifted off from Rocket Lab's launch complex in New Zealand. The rocket carried the 5th satellite for Synspective's Strix constellation into low Earth orbit. This mission was named Owl for One, One for Owl, and as this is just the 5th out of 16 launches for this constellation, Rocket Lab is going to have to hunt for more owl-based puns. Electron lifted off at 16:39 UTC with the satellite encased in a custom fairing. The first stage flight performed without issues, but when staging came around, we all held our breath as the first stage rotated away violently. It even looked like the nozzle of the second stage engine hit something on its way out of the interstage. Fortunately, this didn't end up causing any issues as the second stage ignited without problems, and in the end, the payload was successfully delivered into orbit. CEO Peter Beck later explained that Electron has wide margins for staging, but that Rocket Lab likes staging to be cleaner and will investigate what caused the rotation. Next, on August 4th, we had a Falcon 9 launch from Vandenberg. This was the first mission of Starlink Group 11. A new group usually means that something is different compared to other Starlink missions and often indicates new satellite capabilities or a change to a different type of orbit. Now that said, we don't really know what changed this time around. The 23 satellites were launched into a low Earth orbit with the same inclination as groups 7 through 10, so we'll have to wait and see what's different enough to warrant this new group number. The booster flying this mission was B-1082, which ended its 6th flight by successfully touching down on SpaceX's drone ship Of Course I Still Love You. The booster did have a substantial lean when it returned to the port of Long Beach, which happens occasionally when the landing is a little hard or the seas are rough. Later that day, another Falcon 9 lifted off from Florida, carrying a Cygnus cargo vehicle with a bunch of supplies for the International Space Station. The spacecraft is named SS Francis R. Dick Scobie, honoring the fallen commander of the ill-fated final flight of Space Shuttle Challenger. The mission was originally scheduled for a day earlier, but was scrubbed due to bad weather. But the weather improved for the second attempt when T-0 came around at 15:02 UTC on August 4th. The booster for this mission, B-1080, flew for the 10th time and successfully landed on Landing Zone 1 at the Cape. While the launch went smoothly, Cygnus experienced an issue on the way to the International Space Station when the spacecraft's first engine burn was automatically aborted due to a low pressure sensor reading. After evaluating the data, engineers at Northrop Grumman concluded that it was safe to proceed, and Cygnus performed 2 so-called delta velocity burns to make up for the missed burn. Despite the issue, Cygnus still arrived at the ISS at its scheduled time on August 6th, after which NASA astronaut Matthew Dominic captured the spacecraft using the station's robotic Canadarm. Roughly 2 hours later, Cygnus was berthed to the Unity module's Earth-facing port, and the astronauts commenced the unloading of the nearly 4,000 kilograms of cargo on board. We also had a Changzheng 6A launch from the Taiyuan Satellite Launch Center in China. The mission lifted off at 6:42 Universal Time on August 6th, carrying the first 18 internet satellites for the Qianfan, or G60, constellation. This constellation is often referred to as the Chinese version of Starlink. The first phase of this will consist of nearly 1,300 satellites to be launched by 2027. But there are also plans to eventually expand the constellation to a massive 12,000 satellites. Later in the week, it was reported that the Changzheng 6A upper stage had exploded a day after satellite deployment. Several organizations have now reported tracking debris from the breakup, with LeoLabs tracking over 700 pieces of space debris. Alarmingly, these explosions seem to have become the norm for this rocket, as the upper stages for 4 out of the 7 Changzheng 6A launches did not re-enter in one piece, but rather broke up and left a lot of space debris instead. Going into next week, we'll have a Falcon 9 launching another Starlink mission on August 10th. Liftoff is set to take place from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida during a 4-hour window starting at 11:21 UTC. The following day, Electron's next launch is set to take place from Rocket Lab's spaceport in New Zealand. This mission will carry the third Acadia satellite for Capella Space into low Earth orbit. Liftoff is currently scheduled for August 11th at 11:15 Universal Time. On August 12th, Falcon 9 is set to launch from Vandenberg, carrying 2 satellites built by Northrop Grumman into a highly elliptical orbit. The satellites are outfitted with multiple instruments from different providers, including the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, Inmarsat, and the U.S. Air Force. Liftoff is currently scheduled for 2 o'clock UTC. The Progress MS-26 cargo vehicle is set to leave the International Space Station on August 13th. Undocking is currently scheduled for 2:03 UTC. The spacecraft will then burn up on re-entry and dispose of some waste from the orbital outpost while doing so. Now that's a way to take out the trash. We'll have another Falcon 9 launch on August 14th, launching 2 Earth observation satellites for Digital Globe's Worldview Legion constellation into a sun-synchronous orbit. The launch will take place from Florida with a return to launch site landing, so get ready for sonic booms and some amazing views. On August 15th, the Progress MS-28 cargo vehicle is set to launch from Baikonur in Kazakhstan. The spacecraft will bring more supplies to the crew on board the ISS. Liftoff is scheduled for 3:20 UTC. Less than half an hour later, another launch is expected from India. An SSLV rocket is set to lift off from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. This will be the final developmental launch of the SSLV launch vehicle, after which the rocket should become operational. And it looks like August 15th will be a busy day for spaceflight, as the final launch of next week is also planned for that day. This time, a Falcon 9 is scheduled to launch the Transporter 11 rideshare mission from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. And that's your weekly space traffic report. Back to you, Ryan.
And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.